Hi guys, Josh again. We are back for another video. Thanks for joining me. Today, it's all about frequency and time. If I can get you just to do one thing for me, get your students to study more often. Every morning, every night, if possible. The other key thing, if I can get you to do just two things for me, encourage them to spend more time. These two elements, frequency and time, doesn't matter what language, or pretty much what skill you're learning, these two key elements are what we're discussing today. At the end of the video, as always, we're going to come back and I'll give you a little summary. Enjoy. I've said it once and I will say it again. Two of the most important factors that contribute to second language development are frequency and time. This becomes really evident when we think about how often we usually need to encounter new words or structures before we can recall and use them appropriately. In terms of frequency, it has been demonstrated time and time again that language processing and development is highly sensitive to input and usage frequency. And this development relates to all levels of language: phonology, morphology, reading, spelling, lexis and vocabulary, formulaic language, comprehension, grammar, sentence production, and syntax. But how does frequency affect second language development? Well, it is partly as a result of our innate ability to engage in statistical learning. In simple terms, that means our brains tick away, counting, sorting, and connecting the input and output to figure out collocations and patterns of use, etc. Patterns and words that appear frequently in the input and output develop more quickly. Or, to put it another way, the more times we experience something, the stronger our memory for it becomes, and the more fluently it is accessed and used. Now, this seems fairly obvious, right? For example, I work with Korean teachers and I hear phrases like 집중해, which means focus, or 공부 열심히 해요, which means study hard, rather frequently. So I developed the ability to understand and use these phrases rather early in my journey studying Korean. However, the importance of frequency and the role it plays should not be taken to mean that it is only an item's overall frequency count that will guarantee its inclusion into our second language repertoire, or even that it will result in perfect usage of the word or structure. Not at all. For example, think of how much trouble many students have with articles or prepositions in English. And these features appear in almost every sentence. So why does this happen? Why is it that in almost all cases, frequency plays a huge part in what eventually becomes part of our L2 repertoire? But sometimes it seems like it has a very limited effect. Well, it has been argued that students often find some structures or items difficult to learn because even though their form is simple, as is the case with articles or prepositions, their function is complicated and, phonologically speaking, they are generally of low salience. And this is where the teacher comes in. As teachers, we need to understand that although frequency of input and output is really, really important to language development, so is context, perceptual salience, word distinctiveness, and word prototypicality. I know, I'm getting all linguistic-y again, but don't worry. The last thing I intend to do is bore you into switching off this mini lecture, so rest easy. Instead of me going on and on, just check out the points on the screen, or go to my website for more information on these concepts. For now, let's look at the more practical side of teaching and examine what it is we can do to help our students in relation to frequency. First of all, we really need to be aware of how we can not only help our students get the required amount of input and exposure to the target language, but also ensure that the input and output opportunities allow for frequent exposure to and usage of the target structure or items we're trying to teach. One way we can do this is by making sure homework tasks and in-class activities are rich in the target structure or lexical items we desire our students to learn or be exposed to. For example, if I'm trying to help my students understand how to use word orders like first, then, next, and after to help them give structure to a story or presentation, etc., then I set tasks that include examples of this language in use. This could be anything from watching instructional videos on cooking, as chefs usually love to use order words when giving instructions, to reading the instructions on how to do something, or explaining to someone how to do something and prompting them to use order words. However, it's usually going to be a combination of all of these things, so just keep that in mind. The next thing we need to understand with frequency is the idea of recency. By this I mean that the more recently you've encountered a target structure or lexical item, etc., the easier it is to recall. But then this begs the question of how do we know if our students can remember the lexical item or structure because of recency, or if the word or structure has truly become part of their second language? Well, this is a difficult question to answer. I guess, as teachers, the best we can do is try to take into account this concept of recency and make sure that we are reviewing and reintroducing items and structures to help ensure deep learning and development is taking place, not just superficial learning as a result of short-term memory or as a result of recency. One tactic I can give you to help students solidify new words and items is that of spaced repetition. For those of you who don't know what spaced repetition is, it's a proven method of enhancing one's ability to learn, and it has often proven to be especially effective in aiding vocabulary development. In a nutshell, the learner or student deliberately tries to learn something, say some new vocabulary or some new expressions, and they gradually increase the interval of time between their reviews. Okay, this will probably work best by way of example. So say I'm trying to learn some new vocabulary. I might choose to study the same 10 words every day for the first few days. Then I would review them again every 3 or 4 days. Then I might review them at the end of the month. What I'm doing is gradually increasing the time between each review. But the key thing to remember is we really need to encourage our students to focus on recalling the new words and phrases and make sure that they are gradually increasing the space between reviews. At the same time, we should be introducing new vocabulary items into the mix. Now, if this sounds all very difficult, don't worry. There are plenty of places online where you and your students can set up personalized spaced repetition programs to help you learn. Or you can just get your students to make their own flashcards and organize it for themselves. That's totally old school, but totally awesome and effective. Okay, the final factor I want to address in relation to frequency is the idea of saliency. Saliency can be defined as the perceived strength of a given stimuli, or even the memorability of a stimuli. This is important because low salience cues, things that don't really stand out, tend to be less readily learned, whereas words and structures that have a high salience level are often more easily assimilated into our current knowledge. So, it might be a good idea to think of ways to make words, phrases, and structures more salient. And this is where surprise, humor, relatability, focus, and purpose can all play a part. So, it might be worth considering the teaching methods you employ when presenting certain features of a language. For example, making something more salient by explicitly pointing it out, using humor or your tone of voice to stress certain elements, or having the students relate new items to their current needs or contexts. You can even have your students invent their own examples of how items or structures are used, instead of just giving them your examples, as having the students mold and use the items to suit their own needs and purposes often results in enhanced levels of salience. Now, of course, there is a lot more to frequency, recency, and salience than I have time to discuss here, but I hope this little overview comes in helpful. Now, let's look at time. I'm going to keep this short and sweet. First off, don't believe the hype. There is an entire industry dedicated to making our students believe that there is some sort of secret system to expediting second language learning, or that we can somehow hack the brain so we can become fluent in record time. Only minutes ago, just before recording this mini lecture, I did a quick Google search to find out exactly how to learn a language fast. And I found thousands of people happy to provide me with the secret to reaching fluency in record time. All sorts of claims were made. I could become fluent in 3 months, or in just 100 days, I could master a new language. This sort of thing. And in my opinion, these usually baseless claims do nothing but discredit our industry and give our students false hopes. So if this is you, please stop. Let me clarify. I'm not saying that these resources or techniques didn't work for some people. What I am saying is that for most people, becoming fluent or even just reaching an intermediate stage of second language development, takes a lot longer than a few months. It often takes years. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at what the research says. According to the Foreign Service Institute, it takes an adult subject with no prior knowledge of a language between 575 hours and 1,100 hours of teacher-accompanied study just to reach an intermediate level of proficiency. On top of this, we have some Australian data which suggests that it takes about 1,765 hours of teacher-fronted learning for adults to get from no English to a level of competence required for further study or a job. And in studies looking at immigrant children in the USA, it was found that it usually takes several years, sometimes up to 10 years, before immigrant children reach the grade level norms displayed by their English-speaking peers. So, as we can see, for most people, it takes a significant investment of time and effort to learn a language. And as teachers, we need to make sure that our students understand how long it actually takes. Now, in regards to these timeframes, 4 points need to be made. First, these figures are approximations, and factors such as motivation, aptitude, setting, mother tongue, etc. all need to be considered when trying to answer the question of how long it takes to learn a language. Second, these studies all involved intensive teacher-led classes that had the sole aim of helping people learn a language as quickly as possible. Third, time on task was a big factor. In these studies, students were studying several hours a day for months on end, not just a few hours a week, which is common to many second language students. And fourth, the levels referred to in these studies, with the exception of those relating to the younger learners, are far from the levels that one would need to attain before being deemed fluent. But they are levels that many learners would be happy with, as they would allow you to be able to communicate in almost any daily situation and even have more in-depth conversations about special interest topics. And in my mind, that's a pretty good level to aim for. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the more practical side of teaching. With the main question being, how can we help our students get the frequency and type of exposure and engagement with the language they need? Well, I've already given you a couple of tips, so I'll quickly just give you a few other things to remember. First, don't just expect a student to remember something if you've only taught it or engaged with that content once or twice. It's really important that you make sure you're reviewing content at regular intervals. Second, encourage your students to engage with the language on a daily basis and remind them to review words, phrases, topics, and styles, etc. that they have recently studied quite frequently. Also encourage them to use, as in speak or write, as often as possible. This is because using the language really reinforces the form and function connections which are required for more fluent language use in the future. Third, try to make the input more memorable or more salient. Now, this is often hard to do, as it is sometimes difficult to know what is and what isn't salient. But now you know more about the idea of saliency, you can take steps to monitor and I guess enhance the input if needed. And finally, keep in mind that it is input frequency as well as input distribution that matters most. Well, probably not most, but it's really important when learning a language. So keep those things in mind. And there we have it. I hope you now know more about frequency and time and how they relate to second language learning. If you'd like to know a little bit more, you can also check out my lectures and discussions on reading and listening, where I give a few helpful hints about increasing input frequency, and I also discuss with Justin and Tisha how long it really took them to become confident and fluent in a second language. Of course, you can also check out my website for more information. Guys, on that note, let's call it a day. Remember, stick around for the wrap-up at the end, and I hope to see you back here for another mini lecture soon. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed it. What's the takeaway? Really simple. Frequency. Every day. Every night. As often as possible. Then, don't get confused, time That's the duration we're talking about. If you only got a couple of minutes, do flashcards. If you've got longer, do a chapter of a book. Watch a video. You've got to incorporate both elements and encourage your students to do so. Really easy, frequency and time. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. Remember, keep English real.